Okay. Okay. Good evening and welcome. And thank you so much for joining us for our Modern Minds Conversation series, in which we host the leading thinkers and rabbis and educators from around the world to speak about issues, challenges that are very pressing and facing our community. I want to express my gratitude to Heidi Naubert Proa for sponsoring, for dedicating our Modern Minds series, and for their leadership, ongoing leadership and commitment to Beth Jacob and the greater Jewish community. As we head into Hanukkah, and we think about the perseverance of the Jewish people over the course of the centuries, and we think about the external challenges and also the internal challenges that the Jewish people have faced, both then and now, right? By Yama Mahem Bazman Hazeh. And one of the most pressing and significant internal challenges is the relationship, the intersection between religion and state in our beloved Medinat Yisrael. And I think, by the way, that it's beautiful that here with COVID and with everything going on and with the challenges we have, and also getting ready for Hanukkah, that Israel, Medinat Yisrael, is at the forefront of our minds. And it gives us great chizuk for all of us. And we're so happy to see all of you, to welcome you, because we want to be connected. We want to be connected to Medinat Yisrael and to Torah, Eretz Yisrael. And so it's really a great privilege and honor for us to be hosting two leading religious Zionist rabbis who are shaping Jewish life in Israel. On this issue of religion and state, you know, in the States, we value the separation of church and state, and it's something that's doable. But in Israel, it's not just a state, but it's a Jewish state. And so it's much more complicated to separate the state from its Jewishness. Just as an example, you have the whole issue of, Chok HaShvut, which is the law of return. And, following the Nuremberg criteria that anyone with a Jewish grandparent is considered Jewish. And so Israel has followed that criteria, that any person with a Jewish grandparent is considered Jewish from an Israeli perspective and is granted citizenship. Over the course of the decades, we've had the blessing of mass immigration from North America, from Ethiopia, and especially, with over 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union. And so, especially with the latter, you have a situation in Israel that many of you are familiar with, where you have hundreds of thousands who were granted citizenship under the law of return, who may not halachically be Jewish. And so they're individuals who are identify with the state. Their sons and daughters are part of Tzahal, fighting for the defense of the nation. They think of themselves as Israelis and even as Jews, but yet when they want to get married, there are issues, there are problems. And so then, what do you do at that point? How do you deal with that conflict or that tension between the state and the religion? Tzohar, which is the organization of Rav Stav, so they help people research their identity to attempt to resolve the issue in that fashion. If the person is determined to halachically not be Jewish, or if there is a serious doubt, so then maybe we have to then explore conversion. But then what are the standards of conversion? What's the definition of Jewishness? I mean, these are just some of the questions. We have something I'm sure it's going to come up, and I'm looking forward to Rav Lichtenstein or Rav Stav speaking about it. But the whole issue of, what defines Jewishness? And it's not by the foods we eat, but there's specific criteria. And Rus famously said, right, and we read about it on Shavuot in Megillat Ruth, Amecha mi velokayech Elokai. Your nation is my nation, and your God is my God. And that kind of highlights the idea that we're a nation with a history, with a destiny. But at the same time, we're also Elokayech Elokai. We also are a religion. And those are the two dimensions of what it means for us to be Jewish in a general sense. But then how do you deal with perhaps that tension that sometimes arises from state and religion, from Amech Ami, Elokayach Elokai. And the specific questions, marriage and conversion and Jewish identity, these are all major issues in Medinat Yisrael. So it's a great honor for us to have the opportunity to have two individuals, two leading rabbis who are really making a tremendous impact in Israel and around the world, as is evidenced from this program. Rav David Stav is chief rabbi of the city of Shoham, a chairman of the Tzohar organization and co-chancellor of Or Torah Stone Educational Network. Rav Moshe Lichtenstein is Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut, of which I'm a proud alumnus. And Rav Lichtenstein supervises the Kolel Gavoa, the yeshiva's most advanced students. He's also an educator, a senior educator at the Beis Medrash for Women in Migdal Oz. And so these are two individuals who are well known to our community. You know that these are leading rabbis shaping life in Israel, and they're respected, highly respected figures who are teaching and inspiring so many. They're well known to our community. It's great to welcome them back by Zoom in this way. And they're joining us live from Israel. And we appreciate Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Stav, you adapting your schedule, adjusting your schedules to join us. And we changed the time from 8:30 to 8:35, right? Because we had to fit it into the davening so that they would finish tefillah so that they'd be able to hop on to the call. Without further ado, what we're gonna do is we'll have Rav Stav. You have the interview coming up in a few minutes.
In 3 minutes. So let's start with Rav Lichtenstein.
So we'll start. We're going to have Rav Lichtenstein will speak. Maybe you can share 10 to 15 minutes. Then Rav Stav 10 to 15 minutes, and then maybe we'll have a couple of follow-up questions, and we'll take it from there. To Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Stav to talk about what are the challenges, generally speaking, about this intersection between religion and state. And what should be the nature of the relationship? And you could already start talking about how it applies to the specific issues. Pleasure and honor to host you both. Rav Lichtenstein, take it away.
So good evening. It's a bit of a hitch. I was expecting our staff to begin, and then I could just simply respond. Now I have to begin from the groundwork. It's a great pleasure to be in LA without having to travel 17 hours by plane. So. Thank you very much for inviting and hosting us. And I really feel back at home amongst community that I feel comfortable with and familiar with. And it's really great to be back. Okay, I'll start already with the basic. The problem with the issue is that we really believe there's religious value in the interaction between state and religion in a Jewish state. And now the exact formulation, when I follow Rav Kook's formulation, I follow other formulations which maybe give less importance to the historical element. Rav Kook wrote some very far-reaching things regarding the state and its religious significance. The Rav tried to temper it down a bit, but I think all of us agree that there's religious value to having a Jewish state. And I'll say more than that. There's religious value to having a Jewish state, independent of its level of observance. Rabbi for Hanukkah, Rabbi liked to point out often, the Rambam lists the achievements of Hanukkah at the beginning of Hilchos Hanukkah. He mentions, amongst other achievements, V'chazra malchut l'Yisrael yoter matayim shana, that the government of the monarchy was reestablished for over 200 years. Even though, as Rabbi would often point out, you would say exactly that they were all the Trei Karta or the Badats were running all of the Hasmonean governments. Nevertheless, the very fact of Jewish sovereignty and the Jewish state, which identifies as Am Yisrael's ongoing destiny, what the Rav would call in the Brit Avot, in other words, since we have a common historical destiny, has religious value. On the other hand, the modern state of Israel is realized within a secular framework, within it was established by mostly non-religious pioneers. Now, so the problem, in a sense, part of these problems were inherent throughout, or basically, or I should really say implicit from the beginning. Nevertheless, they become much worse as time goes on. And there's a dual reason for that. First of all, I think previous generations had a deep relationship, if you want, with their Jewishness, if you want, with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I'll take things to an extreme. The Gemara says in Masechet Sanhedrin that if a person worships idols out of anger, so I'm angry with the idol, nevertheless I worship it, I violate the prohibition of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah. So the Ran over these, he's a 14th century commentator, he asks, if you do it despite Avodah Zarah, if you are angry, why do we consider you to be worshiping other gods? You're going out of your way to spite them. So he answers, which is the correct and the profound answer, anger is a religious experience. It's a religious sentiment. When you're angry, so you have a relationship. It's not the best relationship, but only those who care about anger us. And in one form or another, you could come and say that in late 19th century, early 20th century, even if the relationship was often one of anger, it was one of a deep connection to Jewish roots. If you're angry at your roots, you are dialoguing, and they're an existential force for you. And this, over time, this certainly was the original state of affairs. As time went on, it's weakened. Additionally, Rav Kook believed that deep down, a good deal of Zionism, of secular Zionism, was motivated by religious sentiment, which the secular Chalutzi may not have been aware of, but nevertheless, he claimed that it was a deep religious sentiment. Now, they saw it as maybe patronizing, they thought he was condescending, but there was a certain kernel of truth to at least a part of the claim. Rabbi used to like to say that most Jews want the Shabbos Goy, that Chilonim in Israel want a Shabbos Yid, meaning they want something to be Shomer Shabbos, not to them, but they do want Shabbos to have a real place in their state. It's like you want your frum relative to say Kiddush, even if you don't want to be the frum relative. So they really wanted to give Judaism and Yiddishkeit and Torah mitzvos a place so they were willing to accept all kinds of restrictions and inconveniences, because deep down they were really interested in the Jewish identity and the Jewish character of the state. And the truth is, if you interacted with secular Israelis, many of them certainly of previous generations or more elderly people now, making Kiddush in the army, the army makes Kiddush every Friday night in all of its bases. Making Kiddush is not just, it's not something a minority feels is being coerced upon. The majority views it as part of being a Jew in Israel, that you hear Kiddush and Shabbos is different, etc. Now, the problem is that this has been collectively weakened. Over time, these things tend to wear away. Current Israeli secular society, certainly parts of it have become much more cosmopolitan, the connection to tradition much more tenuous, and therefore any attempt to insert religion or religious values into the public sphere are more problematic. Just to conclude this introduction, two other points. I think the polarization of Israeli society doesn't help this. The more Israeli society is polarized, not on political issues and on cultural issues, but the fact there's certain correlation between the cultural, religious issue and the political, the geopolitical foreign affairs issue, it creates more animosity, for less willingness to compromise. Some of the emotions from one sphere spill over into the other, and if you're polarized about what to do politically, it also it fuels the cultural I don't say wars, but the cultural conflicts as well, and therefore in general compromise and the like it becomes more problematic when at the end of the day, to live together you need a certain amount of let me emphasize, compromise here is not compromising Judaism, but it is trying to adapt the application to contemporary circumstances. Or to put it differently, halacha recognizes often multiple opinions, and halacha is willing to entertain various options within the halachic spectrum. And applications always takes into account circumstances. That's the classic halachic process. You'll paskin one thing for someone in his house, you'll paskin something else for someone in a hospital. You'll paskin one thing for someone who has no problem replacing the object. You'll paskin something else if you can't replace the object because economic circumstances, because it's Shabbos and you can't cook another meal, or whatever it is. Halacha always takes circumstances into account. And the flexibility, now the question therefore is, A, what's the halachic flexibility available to us? And B, and I'd like to emphasize that the need for halachic flexibility is not because halacha can compromise or is willing to surrender a little, but not to surrender a lot. In other words, adapting halacha to contemporary needs is not a form of surrender. It's like we're willing to sacrifice 10, 20%, but not 80%. Chas v'shalom. The very nature of the halachic process is that halacha is really interplay between idea, capital I, the Platonic idea, and reality. It's the friction between reality and the ideal world is what halacha is all about. And therefore adapting or accepting halachic option A as opposed to halachic option B is part and parcel of the halachic process. However, this makes sense to do this only, maybe I'll give a political example nevertheless, right? Am I willing or not willing to compromise with the Palestinians is function A of what I believe, what I am compromising on is crucial, not crucial. In other words, if I bargain away a certain asset, am I compromising the integrity of my whole state or not? But it's also a function of something else. What do I stand to gain? If I gain everlasting peace in the Middle East, I'm willing to pay one price. If I think I'll get nothing in return, I'll get very little in return. So I have no incentive to do that. And the same is true lahavdil, mutatis mutandis. The same is true regarding these issues. In other words, am I willing to accept a more lenient opinion, which may, for instance, compromise the more stringent character of Shabbos? Am I willing to do that? So it's partially a function. If I believe that by doing so, I will instill the values of Shabbos throughout the country, society will adapt Shabbos as a value. I'm going to be more flexible. If people will not, if you won't change the fabric of society, so why should I compromise Shabbos? And so on and so forth. So that's now the second point is, and I believe there's a profound change going over Israel in the past few years. I emphasize few. I'm talking literally in single-digit numbers. And I believe this may be a game changer and not necessarily a positive one regarding some of these issues. What I mean is that what I'm seeing on the ground now is that Israeli and Jewish identity are drifting apart. There's always been I'll say like this: Israeli and Jewish identity have always sat upon a fault line. Do you identify Israeli and Jewish identity as one and the same? That was certainly the assumption of religious Zionism throughout, and also classic Zionism also basically identified Israeli identity with Jewish identity, and we want a Jewish state, and the identity of the state will be Jewish. Now, it was very simple. Jews were, as I said before, they were either religious or secular, Zionist or non-Zionist. But we're fighting, we were arguing, debating, fighting about the character of the Jewish state of Israel. And Arabs had their own identity. They saw themselves as a minority. They saw themselves as foreigners. And they were Muslim, they were Palestinian, they were different. What's happening in the past few years is Israeli Arabs no longer see themselves as a minority who want only civil rights. They see themselves as Israelis. they have an Israeli identity. I'll give you a few examples on the ground, but they're indicative of much deeper paradigm shift in which this fault line has begun to move apart. Israeli Arabs are Supreme Court justices. They're part of the judicial system. Israeli Arabs are angry at the Israeli police for not entering into their cities and towns and quelling violence. Something which had been unheard of 15 years ago for Israeli Arab politicians to demand police presence in their neighborhoods was unheard of. The police were the Zionist police. And now that the Israeli police have to protect us from domestic violence and the like. There have been, I think there still are, Israeli soccer players on the national team. There are Israeli politicians. 2-3 years ago, no more, no less, there was a high profile case of intermarriage. And the president of the state of Israel, who's a proud Zionist, no more, no less, denouncing the intermarriage as being racist. Meaning, essentially, Israeli Arabs, they're basically failed society now. They view themselves as Israelis. Maybe Israelis with a very particular political position, but Israelis. And the moment you say that, so what you're really saying now, that's one example, but I'll give you another example, which I hope won't anger people too much. There's a very high-profile case here recently. The military rabbinate, the Rabbinut Tzva'it, a paskin that they should bury non-Jewish soldiers in military cemeteries together with Jews. Now, in the past, that was not their policy. Their policy was non-Jewish soldiers were buried in a military cemetery, of course, but in separate sections. Now, what is deep down? If you ask yourself, look in the mirror, deep down, what does this mean? It means it's a question of identity. This is the part. I hear this from the Rav, and it's the whole point of Parshas Chayesara is what is your identity, right? The whole debate there is Avraham a Chiti or an Ivri? In other words, where you are buried is the most deepest expression of your identity. And the Rav used to talk all the time that the French were mortally insulted that Rothschild wanted to be buried in Israel, not in France. Now, when you come and say in the past, what do we say? With all our recognition of non-Jewish soldiers, nevertheless, the fraternity is Jewish. The basic identity is Jewish. So we have to have separate sections because our eternal identity, the one that we take us to the grave, literally, is our Jewish identity. When you come and say now, what's really being said is the Israeli identity is more crucial. So we will bury Jewish and non-Jewish soldiers together because they have in common an Israeli identity. And we will not bury, of course, we will not bury non-Israelis in such a cemetery. Now, I'm not getting into halachic issues of Darkei Shalom, and my point of this is that at the end of the day, such a shift in psak reflects a paradigm shift, that you no longer collapse the two identities into the same square, meaning that Israeli Jewish identity is one and the same. There's Israeli identity and there's Jewish identity. That's why many. Now, how does this influence a conversion? I'll say two sentences and then stop. Conversion is crucial. It's crucial for a variety of reasons, but one of the most basic is because we want these people to be part of a Jewish state. We want to integrate them into our Jewish identity. When you have, it's like this, there are many non-Jewish Israelis, many non-Jewish Israelis of Russian origin. They're quite happy and content to be Israelis without being Jewish. And they don't see themselves being any less Israeli now because they're not Jewish. On the one hand, it's a very negative development because, as I said before, it's really create two identities. On the other hand, the question is, should we now compromise our standards of Geirus and of conversion, which really reflect our most basic identity, when the pressure is somewhat relieved, or to put it differently, when my achievement will be less? Because, as I said before, I think anyways, these identities are somewhat diverged now. So what should be the price I'm willing to pay for conversion when we gave identity. So I understand there are other problems such as preventing intermarriage and the like, but I begin to wonder whether, and simply put, whether this b'di'evid of a b'di'evid, the fact that we may not like these trends, but if we're honest, identify these trends, we may have to come and say that we will have to have anyway separate. The Israeli Supreme Court is set to basically recognize Reform and conservative conversions. What will be the upshot of that? The upshot of that will be that for purposes of Israeli identity, in terms of registration as citizens, so the Reform conversion will make you into an Israeli. It won't make you into a Jew. So anyways, we're going to have separate communities, or we have to have separate lists of Israelis and Jews. And then the question therefore becomes, so what halachic price do I want to pay under those circumstances? I think it changes the equation somewhat. So I'll stop here, and I assume we'll get down into the details of the conversion as we continue.
Okay, thank you, Rav Lichtenstein. Rav Stav, I think you caught much of it, or most of what Rav Lichtenstein was saying, and certainly you're welcome to share your thoughts about, again, this intersection and tension between religion and state, and also even hit on this last point of Rav Moshe. I mean, he spoke about the nature of Jewishness in Israel, about even the Chilonim, who might not be Dati themselves, but they like the fact that there is Datiyut, that there is Jewishness, that there's Kiddush being made on Shabbat. But the last point of Rav Moshe was I think what Rav Moshe was getting at was in terms of, do we compromise, or should we be flexible, or maybe we should not be flexible on conversion standards if, because of this, the developments in identity, we're not gaining as much. And I wonder whether maybe you have a different view, or can share another perspective on both conversion, but also the general issue.
Again, good evening to you, and good morning to Rav Lichtenstein. Well, actually, I have a tradition to debate with Rav Lichtenstein about conversion issues, but I would rather focus on a different aspect of what Rav Moshe was talking about. I want to share with you, the topic of the interview that I was interviewed now, and I think that it's not something that reflects only on this specific interview, but it's something that represents a bit or a part of the dilemmas that we face here in the state of Israel. Look, Israelis don't really know what's their identity. When you ask them, please define yourself. What are you more, Israeli or Jewish? Well, I guess if you ask observant people, they will answer, we are Jewish more before and after we are Israelis. If you ask most Israelis, the word Judaism doesn't mean for them almost nothing, because they don't know to distinguish. The reason why, according to all surveys, 90% of the Israelis will light tonight a Hanukkah candle. What does it mean? They do it because they are Jewish, they do it because they are Israelis. Well, these values are a bit integrated, because for many Israelis, the symbol of Hanukkah light is not Ner Mitzvah v'Torah Or, which they are not familiar with this verse most probably, but it represents for them heroism, it represents for them nationalism. I heard Rav Moshe mentioning in the beginning of his words, Chazra Malchut Yisrael. I guess for many Israelis, the meaning of Hanukkah for them today is the fact that we celebrate the holiday that represents the willingness of Jewish people to sacrifice their lives in order to establish a state. And that's exactly the ideology of Zionism. And that's exactly what stands behind the pioneers that were ready to sacrifice their lives in order to settle the land of Israel, and afterwards to struggle and to fight in order to establish a state. So for them, what is Hanukkah? Is Hanukkah something which is Jewish or something which is an Israeli holiday? By the way, the same thing applies even to Yom Kippur. I mean, for us, I mean, I don't have to explain to you, to your community, which I'm familiar with, that Yom Kippur is a Jewish holiday that deals with sins and with repentance, etc., and with regret and with confession, etc., etc. For Israelis today, the Yom Kippur War is an integral part of Yom Kippur. And so for us to confess is not only to confess on our individual sins, but as well as it's a confession on our sins as a society. We were too arrogant, we were proud of our achievements in the 6-day war, and we were not sensitive, we were not modest enough, etc., etc. Even the melody of Unetane Tokef that I guess in Beis Jacob in LA and other places most probably is a traditional a melody of Unetane Tokef. In many Israeli shuls, Netane Tokef is today composed by a secular producer that was composing this in Kibbutz Bet Hashita, which lost 13 kids in the Yom Kippur War. So for them, Yom Kippur is not only a Jewish holiday, it's a part of our tradition, which is consisted of many, many items, and a part of this is their Israeli identity. I'm emphasizing this not to disagree with Reb Moshe. I think that all the facts that he has mentioned, I agree with. What I heard, what I was not present, I don't know. But what I heard, I think I agree. But what I want to add to that is that the Israeli society is so ignorant today that when you ask them questions of their identity, they don't know what's their Jewish identity. I mean, they don't know Tanakh, they don't know Torah Sheba'al Peh. So when you say, are you Jewish or Israeli? He doesn't know what he is. He doesn't understand his identity. This is my analysis to the Israeli society. Now it has advantage and disadvantage. It means that when Israelis will move to the States, and unfortunately there are many of them that move, not recently because of the COVID-19, but before, many of them will be the first candidates to marry out and to lose their identity, because once they don't live in Israel, they don't have any kind of vaccine to defend themselves from external influences. So therefore, it's clear for me that they will be the first candidates to leave their Jewish identity once they are outside, because they have never experienced and they've never asked themselves, what are we? What is our identity? They're not Israel. They are a bit Israelis and a bit Jewish. Now, the second point that I wanted to point out, and this is already responding to what Rav Moshe was speaking about. Look, for 2,000 years, we experienced Jewish life as communities. I mean, when you live in Beis Jacob community in LA, actually, I guess that you have a kind of solidarity with Jews all over the world, but actually your solidarity doesn't affect your lives. I mean, you don't really care. You can allow yourself to be very friendly with other denominations and to recognize the importance of what they're doing, or to have different views about what they're doing, but it doesn't really affect your life, because you have to take responsibility for your community, and whatever the rabbi is doing next street in his community doesn't affect directly, at least not practically, maybe spiritually, maybe educationally. You will be challenged by your congregants or by your friends or by your kids. Why is the Reform rabbi allowing to do this and you don't allow to do this? I guess you are asking yourself, Rabbi Top, during the Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and maybe Pesach about Zoom, using Zoom in Seder, using Zoom in davening, where I guess your challenges were halachic challenges, but not less than that, spiritual and social challenges. Why can he allow himself to do one thing and you don't do that? You don't allow that. I'm not going into the halachic issues. I'm just describing in general, I guess, the challenges that you had to confront with. But it didn't affect directly. The fact that the reform or conservative rabbi has done something in his community, you had to deal with this, but it didn't coerce you to follow his decision. That's not the case in the state of Israel. I mean, when you have to decide for a country, the state of Israel, let's say I give no importance and no religious importance to the state of Israel. Let's say it's a regular state, but yet I'm not going into the ideological dispute between Rav Kook and others. I'm not going into it, but it's a Jewish state as a fact. I mean, even the secular people understand, at least now, until now, that it's a Jewish state and it's not a state for its citizens. It's not the state of the people that live here, but it's a Jewish state. And that's what stands behind the idea of the law of return. But even without the law of return, that's the essence of the state, that it's a state for the Jewish people. Now, who is Jewish? You have to ask yourself these kind of questions that you never have to deal with. I mean, in your community in Beth Jacob, if somebody is converted in an orthodox, proper way, you receive him. If he's not, he's not. And that's the end of the story. But here you live in a country where 80% of the people are not observant. So they don't accept the halacha as a model that they have to follow. A few percent are reform and conservative, but let's not deal with that. Let's deal with the secular people. Let's ask themselves, why should I follow the Jewish rules when I don't follow these rules at my home? I don't eat kosher at my home, so why should the army kitchens would be kosher? I drive my car on Shabbat, why shouldn't the public transportation work on Shabbat, etc., etc. These are questions that we ask ourselves only because we live in a Jewish state and it's defined as a Jewish state, and there's no other way to define it, because otherwise the law, no law will be able to be implemented if we are not Jewish. So then why do we, if it's not a Jewish state, why is the Jewish holidays are the official holidays of the state? I mean, Shabbat and Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, etc., etc. The non-Jewish people might ask themselves, why aren't our holidays the official holidays of the state of Israel? Or other aspects that define Israel as a Jewish state. Why should the army be kosher? Forget the question of burying non-Jewish soldiers, but why should we keep the rules of Shabbat if the state by definition is not a Jewish state? So that's for summarizing the background of the situation. Now dealing directly with I want to point out 3 or 4 immediate issues that have to be solved. One is the conversion. If we will not find a solution for the huge immigration that has arrived to Israel in the last 20, 25 years, we will find ourselves pragmatically in a situation where the percentage of intermarriage in Israel will increase to 20 or 30 or 40%, and this could be an existential threat on the existence of the state of Israel. Because I cannot think on a situation where religious soldiers, which happen to be today, I think maybe 40 or 50% of the officers in the IDF, I cannot imagine that them serving in the army and sacrificing their lives for a state which is not Jewish, for a state that actually erases all Jewish values. I'm not saying they will leave the country, but I cannot see the passion that is existing today. I cannot see that passion when they go to the army. That's one issue. I'm not talking about the Arab. Rav Lichtenstein mentioned the Arab society that is getting closer to the Israeli society. This has a strategic meaning, what Rav Lichtenstein was speaking about. Can you imagine 1 million non-Jewish Russian immigrants combining themselves with the 2 million Arabs? And actually it creates a kind of a coalition that will define Israel in different ways. And if they will not become Jewish in one way or another, either by proving their Jewishness or by helping their kids to convert. By the way, it's not something that I made up of my mind. the former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, has said that strategically, that's what the Arab are looking forward to see how they combine forces with people that we define them as non-Jewish, and they will become a part of the, let's say, the secular identity of the state of Israel, which is not halachically Jewish and not even spiritually Jewish. So the conversion or proving Jewish roots is one challenge. The second challenge, which is cannot be resolved in a day, but it's a challenge that I think all will agree upon, and that's the ignorance. Ignorance, people that don't know what's Tanakh and don't understand their roots and have no clue. We are now celebrating tonight Hanukkah. I can guarantee that if you ask an average boy or girl in the secular education in Israel, if you ask them, what is that about? Who are the Maccabites? What was the struggle about? They will have no clue about, and they know that they eat latkes or sufganiyot. I don't know what's the literal translation of sufganiyot. I guess you'll find out later. But they eat what they eat, but they have no clue about the historical background of them. Now, ignorance is the biggest enemy of, or the biggest friend of hatred, or being terrified from Judaism. I mean, today the word religization, hadata, which became so popular among the secular people, they don't want to hear, because once you tell them something about their roots, they are terrified that you want to make them frum, or you want to make them observant. And that's why they're not opening the ears in order to listen, to hear about themselves. It's not my history, it's their history just as it's mine. But there is a big fence that doesn't allow them, of course doesn't encourage them to be exposed to their identity. And I want to say one last thing. You know, a few weeks ago, Rabbi Sachs passed away, and one of his very, very nice one of his very nice ideas that he used to say was the following. For 2,000 years, we were the chosen people. Nobody asked us if we want to choose our Judaism or not. We were coerced to be Jewish. The goyim around us never led us to escape from our identity. This has been changed. In the 20th century, we switched from being the chosen people, we became the choosing people. We choose to be Jewish. It's not that somebody forces us to be Jewish. It applies, we used to think, and Rabbi Sachs used to say, it applies to the Jews in America, in North America, in Europe, in other places. And we used to think in Israel that this idea, this vote applies to them in the diaspora. Because over there, they could choose to be Jewish and they could choose not to be Jewish. It's very easy to leave the community, the Jewish community, and to be a part of the global village outside. But what we don't understand is that it occurred to us in Israel as well. Israelis will say to themselves today, we want to choose our behavior, our identity. You don't tell us what is our identity. You will not tell us if we are Jewish or not. You will not tell us what does it mean to be Jewish. We will express our Judaism in the way we believe it's the proper way. And you will not tell us what is Judaism about. Now, this means that if we will not approach to them in a way that will inspire them, in a way that will make Judaism relevant for them, in a way that they will feel that they want to choose Judaism, they will not be a part of this story. Even if practically they still live in the state of Israel, but they will not be a part of this game, and they will not continue the Brit Avot that Rabbi Lichtenstein was mentioning. I think this is a huge challenge for us to expose them to Judaism in a way that they will be proud to belong to these ideas, to this family, and they would want to be a part of this future, not only to be a part, to mention this as a part of their past, but to understand that it applies to them, it's relevant to them, and it could inspire them and help them in the future.
Thank you so much, Rav Stav. If we just following up on that, and maybe just to touch on, you mentioned about the fact that Israelis want to choose, their Judaism, and they want to choose how to live their lives, and there's maybe a resentment of being forced, to keep Shabbat or forced to do certain things. So, to raise to both of you in terms of, let's say, the issue of marriage, and on the important issues of personal status. So at the very beginning, Israel gave the keys of personal status to the Rabbanut. And so if we think about marriage, for example, which of course is one of the, the most exciting time in a young adult's life, and they're getting married. So right now in Israel, the marriage has to be done through the Rabbanut. And so there's, of course, there's a value, we believe, of having religious standards across the board. And once you open up to, let's say, civil marriage, where's the Jewishness? So I'm curious, Rav Stav and Rav Lichtenstein, what you feel about the, kind of like the status of marriage in Israel. There's obviously there's a certain amount of resentment that secular Israelis have towards the Rabbanut, and maybe the way they go about the marriage ceremony and that whole experience. Should there be considered the possibility of civil marriage in Israel, or is it? I know that Sohar has done a lot of great work, and with your leadership, Rav Stav, in terms of trying to improve the system within the Rabbanut. But I'm curious the pros and cons of the argument of some to have civil marriage allowed in Israel.
Moshe?
Moshe, why don't you go ahead on that one? Civil marriage in Israel.
You want me to talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll allow myself a few background comments before I discuss. I'll get to civil marriage soon. First off, Rav Stav is right. This is our third, I think, session. Not all about the conversion, but we've been in London, we've been in Yerushalayim now. We're quote unquote in LA. I think in practice, the differences are less between us than maybe in theory. And in theory, I think we maybe present the broad picture we agree upon. In practice, I'm also not sure the differences are so great, but it's in between. I think there is some, and I'd like not to really relate to what was said before. I think there were three things in Stav's presentation, which were really the essence of it. And number one was, or maybe two things actually. One was that Israelis, in other words, Israelis don't know much of Judaism. If you present it to them the proper way, in the proper light, they will embrace it. As long as you do proper outreach, and as long as it's presented properly and you package it the right way, so they will embrace it. In other words, if you give a smiling Judaism which engages their past, they will embrace. Now, I certainly agree that that's a crucial element, and Kol HaKavod to Tzar for a lot of the good work they're doing regarding that, and it's making certainly making religion much more user friendly regarding the bureaucracy and the like, and the marriage initiative is a wonderful thing. I do have some doubts, though, whether we can, whether that will solve all the problem. In other words, if you talk about what you said before, the couple coming to register in the Rabbanut, the classic secular Israeli couple coming to register in the Rabbanut, so it's spot on. But if you talk about the problematic cases, those in which the personal status is in question, at the end of the day, all of our attempts at being nice, the problem at the end of the day is not PR. The problem is halacha. If you have a Kohen and a Grusha, so no matter how friendly you are and how accommodating you are, you can't make an end run around the halachic problem. And certainly, if you're talking about conversion problems and personal status problems, at the end of the day, the issue is not simply hasbara. It's being having a friendly Rav and not having a bureaucratic Rav who's trying to raise obstacles. The real problem is essence. So therefore I have also, it's like this, it depends what you're talking about. Israel is not monolithic. Many Israelis, indeed, at the moment, are appreciative of their Judaism. Many Israelis want some kind of. Many Israelis have, yes, a pintel yid in them, and they really want their Jewishness to be enhanced, and they're glad to like Hanukkah Licht and the like. There are others who are not, who are antagonistic, and I'm not quite sure that the solution can only be in that. But the real problem is, as a moment ago, the question is not should I be nice when there's no price. The question is at what price? Meaning, what will happen? What will happen when halacha comes to conflict with their needs? The second element was. The second element was that I said like this. I think a good deal of the difference between our opening remarks was that at the end of that, I think Stav was focusing upon what will this do for Israel. In other words, Israel have a big problem. Israel is a Jewish identity. Israel will have soldiers who will not be motivated. The non-Jewish Russians will join forces with the non-Jewish Arabs. It's a strategic threat to the state of Israel. It's a question of the character of Israel, the state. Now, all that's important, and I think both of us agree that we want the state Israel to be a religious state, or that religion and state should interact. But on the other hand, I'm asking myself not only what does a policy on conversion or marriage doesn't impact only Israel; it impacts the Jewish people. And I think the question is not only whether more stringent or less stringent standards, how they impact upon Israel and Israeli identity and Jewish identity in Israel, but how it will impact upon Jewish identity or halakhic identity throughout the world. If we recognize certain standard of conversion here in Eretz Yisrael, where most Jews live, and which is probably standard setting for a good deal of the Jewish world, if we have certain standards here, how they impact upon what goes on in the rest of the world, in other words, what will be the implications for the Jewish people? Now, I'll address the direct question about marriage rather than the conversion issues. There are essentially three options. It's true, Israel gave the keys of marriage to religious authorities, and out of a desire, and I think an extremely responsible desire for the unity of the Jewish people. And people like Ben Gurion were concerned that if there would not be halachic marriage, so then different members of Am Yisrael could not marry within each other, and you couldn't trust. And you couldn't trust to marry a frum person could marry a secular person and vice versa. And because of that, he wanted religious marriage. Now, there always were problems, but I think broadly speaking, the general public, except for the reason I said before, deep down, they recognized and identified with this need, even though they were not observant. At the moment, as time went on, as I said before, it began to unravel a bit. You now have three options, really. Option one is to continue the current model. Option two is to have rabbinic halachic marriage outside the framework of the Rabbanut. Option number three is to have civil marriage. Now, let me say the following. It is inconceivable to have a state in which citizens cannot marry. You can't have a state in which a person can't marry. It's a basic human right. So if you want the current situation to continue, you have to relax the standards of conversion. If you want to relax the standards of conversion, people can't marry. So you have to provide an outlet for them, and it'd be very difficult legally and the like to come and say, okay, if you're non-Jewish, you have civil marriage. If you're Jewish, you can't have civil marriage. There's no way that'll stand up in any legal court. So the moment you have a halachic system, essentially you will have to either provide for those who can't marry. Now, there's only one or two ways of doing that. It's either providing a civil framework, And once you provide a civil framework for 5%, you provide it for everybody. And what's more, liberal Israeli democracy is not going to say only people without only goyim can have civil marriage and not Jews. Within 5 minutes, the Supreme Court will strike that down. So the other option is to bring everyone into the fold, which means to relax the standards of conversion. So you need here either one. You really have two main options. Option number one is to change the standards of conversion and relax them. Option number two is to allow civil marriage. Now, option number three, to have halachic outside the Rabbanut, that will not solve the basic problems. The question there is, if we want to encourage people to marry halachically, how welcome do you want to be? So you can argue that point. Is it worth or not worth it to have it outside the government framework? But having, Rabbanim, it doesn't matter if it's SOAR or any other organization, they're not going to be able to change people with problematic halachic status. Now, a Gush and a Kohen, or a person who is non-Jewish or is halachically non-Jewish, his father's Jewish, his mother's not Jewish, nothing's going to change if we had, if an Orthodox rabbi is Orthodox, he won't be able to do that. It doesn't matter whether he works at the Rabbanut or whether he's working for some private organization. No, he won't be. So therefore, that really is peripheral to the discussion, because at the end of the day, being welcoming and nice is stage B. Stage A here, the crux of the issue really are the conversion issues and the personal status.
Ramosha,
yeah.
One of the participants, Suzanne Spira, asked a question about the possibility of marriage with a non-Orthodox rabbi, that the Rabbanut would not recognize it, but it'll prevent young Jews from marrying in Italy or Cyprus. What about that option? Is that something that's feasible, possibly?
Okay, I'll get that in 20 seconds. No, but I essentially think that, as I said before, the real issue here is one or two models. Now, the basic models here are either changing conversion or allowing civil marriage. Now, there's a price for each of them. Allowing civil marriage, you will pay a huge price in terms of the religious Zionist vision, the sense of Am Yisrael being. Once you have civil marriage and civil burial and the like, you will certainly pay a high price in terms of we'll become a community, not it won't be a people, it'll be a community. It's a high price in terms of the religious Zionist vision. On the other hand, if you opt, so that's why civil marriage is problematic. If you opt to relax the conversion, you pay a high price in terms of Am Yisrael. And I'll say the following: I don't like either of the alternatives, but if I have to choose between an option which is, now also I should also add that civil marriage is ideologically problematic. Halachically, it's not. It's like this: for non-Jews, it's not a problematic. For Jews, it's obviously not ideal. But at the end of the day, I can either, if I have to, my concern is that I'm paying the price in terms of history if I allow civil marriage, but I believe that Geirus, at the end of the day, is the master code to Jewish identity. Who's a Jew? It's not a question of our responsibility to this generation. It's a question of our responsibility to all generations. And come and say, who is a Jew? You define the master code of Jewishness here. Now, there are various opinions about conversion. I'm not talking now which opinion we should adopt. I think in terms of the paradigm, you have to recognize that the extent of conversion really, I think the master code of what being a Jew is much more crucial than the master code of, let's like this, a Jewish state. Now, regarding Orthodox rabbis outside the Rabbanut or non-Orthodox rabbis, regarding that's secondary to the main discussion. Would I trust a non-Orthodox rabbi to form Orthodox marriages? The answer is no. Would I trust an Orthodox rabbi outside the Rabbanut? Yes. But that's a different question. The question would be, in terms, is the institutional price that I pay worth the worth a benefit. That's a question about Rabbanut. Should the Israeli government privatize supervision of pharmacies? If I don't like the policy of the Ministry of Health, should I allow anyone to make their own standards? I'll tell you the truth. If we talk about COVID, I sit here in Israel. I can't believe what's going to the United States. That you have a pandemic and 50 different states, each one dictates its own standards. There's no standard. There's no uniform standards. There's no government setting down a policy for everybody. As they say in Hebrew, zenireh kacha. It's really, what's going in the States. It looks from the far away. So the question is, do we allow lawyers who are not certified by the government? Do we allow pharmacists who are not certified by the government? I think it's no different. If you don't like the Rabbanut, so reform the Rabbanut. You don't have to. It's like if I don't like the Ministry of Health, so I allow any doctor to practice without a license, or do I reform the Ministry of Health, etc. Now, that I think it's secondary to the main conclusion. Can you improve the Rabbanut? Yes. Is that the drama here? No. And that's tough for a different conversation, but it's not the essence of this dilemma. Will I trust a non-Orthodox rabbi? No. It's like I would not go if I don't like a doctor, I won't go to a paramedic instead of a doctor just because I don't like the doctor. And non-Orthodox rabbi, I don't think you can trust him. The price he will pay in terms of institutional standards is not worth it.
Okay, Rev Stav, I want to hear your thoughts about civil marriage, but I also, Susan Spira, Susan Spira is giving off the impression that she is not so excited about the chief rabbinate, and I'm saying that with a smile, which is coming across clearly. But Susan also would like to see Tzohar playing more of a role in the rabbinut, which is something I think that we all would like to see. Jerry asked something that I think that's exactly what I was thinking, Jerry, when Rabbi Stav, you mentioned about Israelis not knowing about Hanukkah and just really thinking about latkes and jelly donuts, that shouldn't Jewish history and our customs be taught in the educational system in Israel? So a couple different, if you could address that briefly and also address civil marriage, following up on Rav Moshe's points.
Okay, I will start with Rav Moshe, and sof we have something to disagree about. I think that
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch
Hashem.
Baruch Hashem. Rav Fruman, blessed his memory, when a couple used to come to him on issues of Shalom Bayis, so he asked them, what are they debating about? And then he came to the point, what was their dispute about. So then he said, wow, Baruch Hashem, we have a machloikes, and he smashed with his hand, Baruch Hashem, now we have a machloikes. Now I understand what's the machloikes about. So, okay, so I will start with the issue of civil marriage. I think that I fully agree with Rav Moshe that the problem is not only the nice face of the rabbinate. It's important, but that's not the main issue. The issue that we deal with is the halachic challenges. Now, if it was only Kohen and Grusha, I think it's such a small number that I think it could be solvable, not within the halacha, but I guess the state could have said, well, if couples don't have halachic solutions, we will make kind of a couple registration or whatever. And there are solutions that the Supreme Court would accept and wouldn't raise an obstacle on that. I don't think that's the issue. The main problem, as Rav Moshe has mentioned, is the fact it's not the Kohen and Grusha, but the problem is hundreds of thousands of people that halachically are not Jewish. Now, if it was only the question of standards of conversion, I could even agree to what Rav Moshe was saying. But I think the problem is much deeper. Look, we have today, updated to today, we have about 1.5 million Israelis that have to go through a process of proving their Judaism. Most of them are Jewish, but 30% of them will not be Jewish after all the investigations and after all what Zohar and others will do. Now, once we announce today that there is no civil marriage, that there is civil marriage, and that the rabbinate is not anymore the only player in town. The meaning of that will be that this 1.5 million people will never deal with proving their Jewishness, because they will not be motivated. Those who need to convert and today are motivated to do that, it's true, it's a conversion for marriage purposes. I'm aware of the fact that historically speaking, this was not the highest motivation to convert, but nevertheless, they still want to convert, and there are small numbers of conversions. All this will disappear in one day, because once we announce that there is a civil marriage, and in order to establish Jewish life in Israel, or Jewish marriage or Israeli marriage, it's enough to register in the municipality or in the local domestic court. That will be the end of the Russians and Americans and others that want and need to prove their Jewishness. The result of that is that within 20 years, maybe less, we will be a society that is divided to big major parts. One is halachically Jewish, and one is Israeli or secular Jewish. Now, talking about the meaning of splitting the Jewish nation to actually two different and separated kingdoms. One would be just like the kingdom of Judea and the Israeli kingdom almost 2,500 years ago. That's the meaning of it. Medinat Yerushalayim and Medinat Tel Aviv, it's called. There is even a series in television which is called Autonomies that deals with the scenario of dividing Tel Aviv to a separate state and Yerushalayim to a separate state. And for many Israelis, that's their dream. They want to separate. They want to cut off all the connections with the Jewish roots, especially with the religious people, which they love to hate, especially after the COVID-19. I guess it's not only in Israel, it applies to the States as well. And they will be very happy to separate ourselves. And for me, it's a recipe for another disaster in the state of Israel, and we cannot allow ourselves to do that. Now, I will not go into the details. We have dealt with that with Rav Moshe in different places about the standards of conversion. It's true that we pay a price in the standard of conversion. By the way, even now, even in I used to say that the lowest level, lowest standard in Orthodox rabbinate in America is 10 times better than the highest standard of conversion in the rabbinate in Israel. When I hear the rabbis here deal between themselves, should we recognize this rabbi's conversion or that rabbi's conversion? I'm talking about Orthodox conversions in North America, and I know what's going on in the conversions, in the most Haredi conversions in Israel. I know for sure that the highest standard in Israel is 10 times less than the standard of conversion, the worst conversion in America. Yet, I think that we don't pay the price. I'm not talking about the halachic issues, I'm talking about an historical view on the Jewish nation. I could almost guarantee that whoever who lives in Israel is 80% or 70% that his son, his grandson, his granddaughter will be a part of the Jewish story. He will be aware of that, he will not be aware of that, but 80% that he will be part of this story. What I cannot guarantee about any conversion, even the best conversion in America, that I don't have to tell you the numbers in America. It's not because we are better and you are worse. It's just because we live here surrounded in Jewish society, what in America is running in a different way. Now, referring to the question about teaching history, let me tell you something. It's not that secular students do not learn Tanakh and do not learn Jewish history. Of course they learn. They learn. But if you ask them, did they listen to what they learned? The answer would be no, because nobody's interested in these stories. It's not a question of learning 1 hour or 2 hours a week about Jewish history of Hanukkah. I guess the story of Hanukkah was taught in all Israeli kindergartens in age 4 or 5. But if you ask today the students that is 15 or 16 years old, if you ask them what is Hanukkah about, maybe he will remember a part of what he heard from his kindergarten teacher, but not more than that. And that has no taste. I mean, it has no meaning. I mean, every Israeli knows that on Rosh Hashanah we eat apple with honey. Does this represent the idea of Yom Adin of Rosh Hashanah? Is this the story of Rosh Hashanah? I mean, you can learn, but not to absorb from that nothing to your life, and it's not relevant to your life. The same thing applies to Tanakh. But I think I've told in your community, in your shul, one of the stories. One day, and I will end with this regarding this question. A few years ago, the principal of our high school, our secular high school, called me to come urgently to school. There is a gathering of the teachers. They came back from Poland and asked what happened. And she tells me, well, we went to Poland and we were meeting a group that came from Australia or England or elsewhere. And they had a Holocaust survivor that was reciting Kaddish in one of the ceremonies that they were doing there in one of the concentration camps. And the students asked the teachers, what is he saying? What is he saying? What is Kaddish about? Forget the fact that the students didn't know, but the teachers didn't know to explain what is Kaddish about. So she comes to ask me to talk about Kaddish, to explain. Now they want to plan their next trip to Poland to explain what's Kaddish about. So I say to her, look, I have no problem. I will come to the students. I will talk to them about Kaddish. But you know, Kaddish is usually said by us towards the end, after people pass away. But Judaism doesn't start with Kaddish. Judaism starts with Modeh Ani Lefanecha. I mean, Chanukah, to Hallel, to praise Hashem, to thank Him for what He's giving us. I mean, the word Judaism begins with the word Yehuda, Apam Odeh et Hashem. I want to thank Hashem for what He's doing for us, for the fact that we are privileged to live in such a miraculous era in Jewish history. We have so many reasons to thank Hashem. This is what Judaism is about, to be aware of your life, to be aware of the meaning of your life. You want me to start with the end? You want me to start with the Kaddish? I mean, I'm ready to do that, but that's not Judaism. It's something else. I mean, it's a part of the Jewish rituals, but that's not Judaism. And I think that that's the answer to the question. People will be ready to open their ears if they feel that I treat them and I talk to them in the eye of the eyes, if they understand that I really care about them, that I want to embrace them, and I don't want to judge them, and I don't want them to be like me. I just want I want to share with them our common inheritance.
Wonderful. That's a great way to wind down the discussion. And it's getting, Rav Stav, Rav Lichtenstein, it's getting late here in Los Angeles. We feel so privileged and honored to have this great opportunity to have this, to hear this fascinating conversation about these critical issues in Israel. And so, thank you so much. Maybe to end the discussion. Go ahead, Rav Moshe.
I'll take 120 seconds if you don't mind. I agree with Stav's concern and vision for becoming two nations. I share the same concern, and as I said before, I think Kol HaKavod for a lot of the good work that Sarah is doing to make Judaism accessible. However, I just have the following. I have the following statement, the following question. The statement is: I'm not sure that leveraging marriage is going to be the solution. That's why I described in my opening remarks is a cultural shift. And I think essentially the problems are cultural, and they will have to be solved by not you leverage the Rabbanut to get people to inquire about the Judaism, because basically we are leveraging governmental authority at the end of the day. It's not going to solve the cultural issues. These have to be, I think, dealt with from a different perspective. And that's why I'm skeptical that this will necessarily be the incentive to keep us together. The question I raise is the following. Maybe by releasing, at the moment, a good deal of the problem is what they call kfiyat datit, or religious coercion. In other words, when religion is part of the government, so it loses inspiration. It's not an inspiring force. It becomes a bureaucratic force. Most Israelis view marriage and the Rabbanut. What does the Rav do? He's a functionary. He serves a bureaucratic function, like he's justice of the peace, really. If you release that, if you make marriage, if there's a civil option, I don't think we should do zachatchila. But if strict will force us, you then free up the religious function to be inspiring. I don't know whether it's the moment tethering religious marriage to governmental functions may not be in the long term the best way of doing it. It may in the reverse. It may cause this to be. The Israeli sees that the government and the Rabbanut as a bureaucrat, and maybe by if we feel that people no longer are willing to accept this as a prize for Jewish marriage, maybe the reverse. As I say here, afuch al afuch, maybe by allowing the Rav to be more to be, not because you're forced to do it, that may make it more inspiring. I don't know, but I just think that these trends are more cultural, and I don't think that by using legislation we're going to solve these problems.
Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Stav, maybe just to conclude the program, just fascinating issues. Thank you so much for giving us of your time and energy and wisdom to help us have a better understanding of these critical issues for our whole nation and the state of Israel, which we so identify with. Maybe to end off the program, if you could share just in one line, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you feel just for Medinat Yisrael? What's a challenge, a greatest challenge, but also something that you're really excited about? What's the challenge facing Israel, but also like an exciting development in Israel? What would you say if I have to ask you in a few seconds, just to end off the program with a quick snapshot of that? Rav Stav and Rav Lichtenstein.
I will say very quickly, since I have to run to the Daf Yomi that I give in a few minutes. I think we all have to realize that we live in a really miraculous era. We have a state, and we have the Jewish people here in Israel that, despite whatever was discussed here, I think deep in the heart want to be a part of the Jewish story, celebrate in different ways the Jewish holidays, to walk tonight in Israel, although it will be forbidden most probably because of the COVID, but to walk tonight and to see everywhere the Hanukkah candle that lights in 90% of the Israeli homes is something that gives you a feeling of really coming back home after 2,000 years of exile. It's an amazing feeling to feel that we are privileged to see things that our forefathers could only dream about. I'm talking not about the people, in Warsaw or in Kovna 180 years ago. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking even about the people that lived here 2,000 years ago. I think they would have just be more than delighted to see how the Jewish people are coming back home and try to live in different ways to express their Jewish identity or their Israeli identity. The biggest challenge is to make sure that this will continue. Nobody is promising us that it could not disappear. We were here in the times of the Maccabites, as the Rambam was quoted already, for 200 years, which really were not more than 80 years of independence. That's a challenge. And we have to make sure that the Jewish the Jewish state will continue to flourish, continue to increase, and we have to dream and to make it happen. The Jewish people from all over the world will see Israel as their home, will come home, and will see, even if they don't come here to live, will see this place as a source of inspiration. Chanukah Sameach, and I must leave, and I apologize for not staying and saying shalom to everyone, but I must finish.
Thank you, Rav Stav, and we're going to do everything we can, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, to be partners with you here from the Marav, but to visit Israel, to support Israel, to make Aliyah, and to do everything we can to help you realize that vision. Okay, cult of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe, share us.
I basically say amen. I say amen. I'll say amen to everything Rav Stav said. I think he stated it beautifully. I'll just add, one sentence. I'm about to walk to the yeshiva in a few minutes. And from the path Alon Shvut, I can see places where Avram Avinu wandered. If Avram Avinu went from Hebron to Yerushalayim for the Akedah, he passed by Alon Shvut in some form or another. And David HaMelech probably took his sheep to pasture, somewhere in my backyard maybe or whatever. In other words, the connection, reconnecting to Eretz Yisrael, which really was a dream 800 years ago, is so inspiring. And to put it differently, all the problems we discussed about the problems Jews 200 years ago would have given an arm and a leg to discuss these problems. It's what they call in Hebrew tzarot shel ashirim, rich man's problems. We have I wouldn't say an embarrassment of riches, but we certainly have, because Baruch has given us so much relative to previous generations to live. These are challenges which prove the success of Am Yisrael and of Tzionut, and Halavai. These should be our problems and not the problems that we struggled with in Galut for 2,000 years. So like I said, I'll say hello tomorrow. Thrilled with all of this. The challenge, I agree with Stav. Say the challenge. I'll try to pinpoint it more. The basic lesson of Sefer Breshit is external challenges can be overcome. They threaten, they're serious, but Esav can be overcome. Internal division is the one challenge that you cannot overcome. In Parshas Vayishlach, at the end of the day, Yaakov Avinu emerges. He may be limping a bit, but he emerges fine. Vayeshev, his family is devastated, and it takes 400 years in Egypt to restore what happened. That's the basic lesson of Bereshit. The internal division is always more dangerous than external threats. And I think the biggest challenge is the internal divisions in Am Yisrael. It's a positive sign that the Jews fight. When fight is a sign of a relationship. When you're apathetic and you don't care, when you basically fall off the screen, so you don't fight anymore. If you're too distant, you don't care anymore. So on one hand, all these fights, between different factions in Israel and outside Israel, are signs that we're still one people, one family. However, I'll conclude with a story. It's a wonderful story, and I love telling it. About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever, we had a Seder, a family Seder. As you can imagine, and I'm sure all of you have experienced this also, you come to the Seder after 2 weeks of a lot of work, and everyone's exhausted, and people are hungry and tired, and kids, but not only kids, adults, their nerves are frayed, because will my kids say the Bani Shtana properly? There's a huge amount of tension by the adults, how the kids will perform. The kids are tired and hungry, and the kids are at about 1:30 a.m. After the Seder was over, all of this spilled over into a shouting match between different elements of the family. And my 14-year-old daughter was very upset. She says to me, "Abba, we will never talk to our cousins again." So my mother's a social worker and a very wise woman. She said to her, "Listen, every family has its fights. The difference is good families know how to reconcile. And bad families, the fights tear the family apart." So I can say, I hope Am Yisrael is a good family, and that all the fights, they come together. We don't sell our brothers, but we view this within a good family relationship. I think that's the biggest challenge, to recognize that Kulanu b'nei ish echad anachnu, and not that Chas Hashem becoming 2 nations or 4 nations or 10 nations. As long as we recognize the company, we'll sort things out. Hashem.
Okay, Yasha Koach, Yasha Koach. Thank you so much, Rav Moshe, for enlightening us and also inspiring us. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu continue to bless you in all your avodas HaKodesh. And we greatly appreciate your being with us for this program. And thank you all for joining us. And Chanukah Sameach to all. Rav Lichtenstein.
So thank you for inviting both of us. I'll allow myself to speak of Stav's name as well. Thank you for inviting both of us. Both of us enjoy first of all interacting with the community, and we certainly wish the community health and the top of health, of course, everything else, and to stay in touch with Eretz Yisrael. And it's really a wonderful sign that these discussions engage you, and also that there's knowledge, the community's knowledge about these issues. I think it's also both myself and Rav David. We also, I think, we benefit from this. He forces me to think my positions. I force him to think his positions. And I said before, in practice, I think the distance are less than theory. But at the end of the day, I think both of us benefit from the need to articulate and to argue. And so to Rabbi for that excuse. And really, thank you very much for inviting all of us. And we'll be able to see each other in person, Be'ezrat Hashem, hopefully in this side of the ocean.
Chag Sameach.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Chanukah Sameach.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.